Um, RFK, I think the freak out on RFK might be, I don't know where the freak out is greater, on RFK, Tulsi, or Gates. I would say the Tulsi Gabbard freak out has probably overtaken the RFK freak out, and they're drowning each other out. But the RFK freak out, who is being driven by, the expert community that gained so much prominence during the COVID era. And it's, understandable or predictable that they would do this, because RFK has been nominated to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, something I did not expect Trump to do. It is one of the largest agencies in the federal government. And if he were to secure that nomination, be confirmed, it would be a coup. It would be a hostile takeover of someone who opposes all the interests that have dominated that agency. And so the confirmation fight over RFK, I think, will be intense. It'll be something we haven't witnessed before. Here's the freak out from Dr. Sanjay Gupta on CNN.
Steer clear of politics, but this really isn't about politics, because this is somebody who has been, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has been pushing quackery, who has been pushing lies, who has been pushing conspiracy theories. You've been talking to experts in the health community, the medical community, preparing for him, RFK Jr., to be given some sort of role in health. What have they said to you?
Well, it's not often that the entire medical and public health community is going to be in lockstep on something, but they're pretty close on this in terms of their significant concerns, horror even. Somebody said to me today, I can't think of any single individual who'd be more damaging to public health than RFK. Keep in mind, I think if the reporting's correct and the job is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, that comprises the CDC. We just got through this pandemic, comprises the FDA, comprises the NIH. He's talked about wanting to basically strip funding for infectious diseases overall. Again, just coming out of this pandemic with concerns about other viruses and things out there. The challenge, I think, is that at the same time, there is this whole idea that we're not a very healthy country. We spend $4.5 trillion on healthcare, and we have some of the worst outcomes in the developed world. And our food supply and other things are partly to blame, things that he's talked about. So there's these kernels of agreement with regard to the medical establishment and the public health establishment in particular. But then there's these other things like Caitlin was just talking about that they're not alternative views. They are false views. People often say, well, these are alternative views. They're not. People say, well, look, I think maybe vaccines could be linked to autism. Fair enough. That was an issue that came up, and it was studied in these large studies, global studies involving hundreds of thousands of kids who were followed for over a decade to see if there was in fact a link. Some of the studies actually showed that you were more likely to have autism if you were not vaccinated. But the point being that issues are raised, issues are studied, and yet they still keep coming up. And I think that's one of the big concerns. That's a metaphor, I think, for other things that people are concerned about with him.
I think that independent journalism causes autism. There should be a study on that, but I mean, they're going to hit him on that pretty hard. That's Sanjay Gupta, who's CNN's supposedly apolitical doctor, who was spouting some of the most debunked lies of the COVID era. And that's what this is really about. It's not going to be about, the MMR vaccine. That's not why RFK is there. Sanjay Gupta, when he went on Joe Rogan, was kind of humiliated by Rogan and was unable to back up a lot of the quote unquote science against someone who is like an MMA bro who was a game show host. And it really humiliated the expert class. And that's when the attack on Rogan came down, spearheaded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which is very close to the intelligence world, and brought like 100 doctors behind Neil Young. Remember Neil Young? Did condemning Rogan. They somehow found Neil Young, who we don't hear from him anymore. Like his brain is like 72% bong water at this point. I'm a fan of his, but come on, Neil Young. And Rogan suddenly toned it down. So there's a lot of resentment there against this whole world of alternative doctors, the Robert Malones who appeared on Joe Rogan, Rogan himself, and RFK, he's really at the top of the totem pole of people who questioned the whole COVID response from the beginning and basically got it right. And he's so hated by the whole expert class that got everything wrong and saw its credibility collapse in front of the eyes of millions of Americans. There are millions who still follow them, who still believe in them, you know, who are closer to the expert class, like people who have graduate degrees and believe in credentialism, many people on the left. But I don't even want to get into a debate on whether RFK was right about this or that. You know, he's called for removing fluoride from the public water supply. Someone who is one of the biggest COVIDians, Dr. Liana Wen, who is on CNN all the time calling for banning the unvaccinated from public travel, from even like being on city buses, just isolating them from society, actually started to examine her own views and came out towards the end of the pandemic as someone who said that we shouldn't have done this. It was destructive. And she has an op-ed in the Washington Post declaring that RFK might actually be right about removing fluoride, that no country in Western Europe does this. But that's not the debate I want to get in. And anyway, I will be demonetized. I'll probably be demonetized for saying anything about this. The point I want to make about RFK is that, and I wrote this up on Twitter last night, is that he wouldn't be here if the expert class, if the Faucis, if the Sanjay Guptas, if the Francis Collinses at NIH, if the Javier Becerras at HHS, if the whoever that lady at CDC was, who was just like a PR operative, if they had gotten it right, and if Rachel Maddow had gotten it right about the jab, there would be no RFK. You know, if you know RFK, he's pretty comfortable in the world of West LA. He has a famous actress wife. He's wealthy. He was, despite being a quote unquote vaccine skeptic, was pretty well accepted in the world of affluent liberals. He was loyal to the Democratic Party. He tried to run as a Democrat. But then COVID came along. He had his children's health defense, and he was the guy everyone looked to. And he called out the whole thing and said, this isn't going to work, and it's going to be deeply damaging to constitutional rights. And so I wrote that if the mRNA had not failed on its major stated promises, had the CDC and WHO not changed the definition of vaccine to accommodate those failures, had countless working class Americans not lost their jobs for refusing to take the jab, while others were basically forced to do so in order to maintain their livelihoods, and I know some who suffered injuries, had mainstream news hosts like Don Lemon and Jake Tapper and others, and Biden himself not proposed isolating the unvaccinated from society, condemning them for fighting for their freedom, and had the lockdowns, remote schooling not set a generation of kids from across all social strata back years in their education while not stopping the spread. Had our city centers, and we saw this here in Washington, D.C., not been transformed into terrifying zombie scenes where countless small businesses were shuttered, especially in D.C., it hit Black-owned businesses really hard. Well, we were constantly assured by Fauci that it would take just another week or two to flatten the curve. Had we not seen this dystopian state censorship regime consolidate its hold over every social media platform, including Twitter, which would have been completely off limits to people like us if Elon hadn't taken over. It's just a fact, whatever we think about Elon and his right-wing views. Had protesters, people protesting the lockdowns, not been demonized as terrorists and beaten and arrested. Had none of that occurred, RFK would still be safely ensconced in West LA. We wouldn't be talking about him right now. No one would care about him. All the Democrats wouldn't hate him. They'd consider him a quirky fellow who's still part of the Kennedy world and someone that they want to actually get close to. But that's not what happened. And we can't deny that this didn't happen. People can't keep just saying, oh, there were no real lockdowns. You're just denying the experience of millions and millions of Americans who paid the cost for the lies and the deceptions of the expert credentialed class. And now RFK stands to take over this gargantuan federal agency that, let's face it, traditionally has served as an instrument of big pharma and the agribusiness lobby. And who's leading it today? You see, oh, they're saying, his critics are saying, well, he has no background as a scientist or as a doctor. Javier Becerra is a Democratic Party operative. He's a lawyer. He's not an expert himself. So the pundits who paint RFK's rise as this triumph of the paranoid style in American politics and right-wing extremism and medical quackery, they need to understand this would have never happened if they hadn't lied, if they hadn't spread disinformation. And there's a large segment of the public, part of it gathered in Washington for the Make America Healthy Again rally, which I thought was just like a sheepdogging spectacle and nothing would come of it. Most of them are like independent voters who follow Rogan and Russell Brand and other alt media influencers. That would have never come to bear. It would have never happened. That part of the public wants a reckoning, and that's simply why RFK is there. And I am not going to say that he's going to do anything to follow through on any promise. This is not an endorsement of him, and we've gone off on him on this show again and again for his genocidal views towards Palestinians, calling Palestinians the most pampered people in the world, repugnant views. But he's not in charge of any foreign policy, any part of Trump's foreign policy agenda. So let's at least put all of this in historical perspective and look at this with some level of sobriety, if possible. That's my take on RFK.
I stay away from RFK's views on all these health matters because it's just not my forte. But the part of your argument that I definitely agree with is like when you treat half the country with contempt, when you mock people, when you force people into conditions, and we saw the hypocrisy, like people like Gavin Newsom of California going out to fancy dinners while ordering people to lock down.
And disappearing when something happened to his face and he disappeared for 10 days and never explained it. Remember that?
Yeah. Or there was a top public health official in New York who was like telling everyone to lock down while still having, parties for himself and his friends. When you see that level of hypocrisy and that contempt for people who don't go along, you're going to have a backlash. And I think that backlash helped fuel Trump's victory. And now he's taking advantage by trolling his opponents by appointing people like RFK and Matt Gaetz at DOJ. Matt Gaetz, which to me is I think the most trollish pick of all, because Matt Gaetz is like an
epic troll.
Yeah, that's just a really big troll move. But that's but this is the payback. People also don't take into account the impact of Russiagate. When you frame the president as a Russian agent, when you weaponize the DOJ and intelligence agencies against him to constrain his presidency, when you repeat that again in 2020 by pretending that this Hunter Biden laptop was a Russian operation, people are going to be angry about that. And when their turn comes to go back in power, they're going to respond. And that's what I think Trump is doing now with some of these trollish picks. Someone like Matt Gaetz, who's obviously a hardcore Trump loyalist. But again, when Jim Comey was at the director of the FBI, he was sending his agents to the White House to entrap basically Mike Flynn which succeeded in getting Mike Flynn to resign, approving wiretaps of Trump campaign volunteers based on disinformation funded by Hillary Clinton, and treating everyone who voted for Trump as a malleable dupe of Russia, and basically endorsing this elitist view that anyone who turned away from Hillary and voted for Trump was just brainwashed by Russian memes. When you have contempt for so many people, they're going to be contemptuous of you and they're going to revolt. And that's what I think we've seen with Trump's victory in 2024.